Good morning. I'm Dr. Bone.
And I'm Dr. Chartalia.
Welcome to Yodo. Today, what we want to talk about with you is getting the good out of hospice. Getting hospice services long enough to get the good out of it.
That's a great topic. We have found with the comments of our previous videos that we keep hearing comments of hospice is for near death. And recently, yesterday, I had a patient that I've been seeing for the last 9 months, and he's been very, very ill. He's going in and out of the hospital, and I'll actually be going out for a live visit to meet the family. And when I spoke to his daughter yesterday, because he's back in the hospital again 9 times this year, and I started referring that I think hospice would be a great benefit to him. It will prevent him to be out of the hospital, be around with his family. She actually said to me, no, we will do hospice when my father stops eating and stops drinking. Right now, I'm going to stick to my beet juice to help him get stronger.
Wow. He's not even able to be at home. He's spending a lot of his valuable time that's limited going back and forth to the hospital.
Yeah, he's had a significant functional decline, and what I mean by that is he was the type of guy that was out mowing his lawn. He lives near like a lot of farmlands in Central Florida, and he was a go-getter. Now he really can't do much of anything. He's very weak because his blood count is low, and we just don't even know the reason why, what the etiology of it.
Wow.
So some of his hospitalizations warrant him to stay in a rehabilitation center for several weeks after he's hospitalized. And other times he does come home, but he's home maybe for 72 hours and then he bounces right back.
My goodness. That really does rob you of your time. And I had a little smirk on my face when you said about going to rehab. I've had many patients tell me, yeah, I want to go to rehab. Tell me about rehab. And I just say rehab is boot camp for older people, because they work you. You work very, very hard to go to rehab. Years ago, Medicare, CMS, used to cover for up to 99 days, I think 100 days of rehab, and you just went and you got that rehab and it paid. Well, change after change after change have occurred in Medicare, and now it's a tiered payment system. And so they pay for the first week or 2 weeks, but that's the first segment, and that's the highest level of pay. But it also has really strict guidelines from the insurance companies. And if you don't improve, they don't continue to pay.
Yeah, and I think that is the key word, improve. A lot of people think they're going to go to rehabilitation to get a little bit stronger just so then they can go home and be back to their regular baseline without putting in the work. And it's a lot of work, and you have to improve. And oftentimes this patient subset that we're discussing, they've had such chronic illnesses and multiple disease modalities that are affecting their activities of daily living. They never can really improve.
And so it is true, the old adage of, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. They want to improve. They want to get better, but they just don't have that capability anymore. Their body is just, at that point where it's so much work and it's so hard, and they physically cannot, no matter how much they want to. How long do you think a person needs to be on hospice to get the good out of it?
I really think the full 6 months. That's what I personally believe. But I'm an empath, and I look at the services, and I think by 6 months, you're able to have the rapport you need with your hospice team. You've met all the staff, and you're able to really tap into all the benefits.
So 6 months gives you enough time that you can meet that entire team. And I know in some of our other videos we've talked about what is included in hospice, what that team means. So you know that you're gonna, talk to someone about receiving hospice, and they're gonna give you kind of a gloss over of what it's gonna entail. And then when you accept that hospice service and you sign a bunch of papers, just basically legal stuff, so that hospice can get billed. It doesn't really affect you any. It's just so that hospice, is basically promising you that they're going to deliver those services. You're going to have a nurse. She's going to evaluate you at least once a week, but more often and available 24 hours a day. You're going to have an aide. The aide's going to come to the house
Usually it's 2 to 3 times a week, but again, it depends on the patients. If they're a little bit more independent, then maybe they just come once a week, but I've never seen anything less than 2 to 3 times a week in my career.
I've seen some patients that really only need the aid once a week or maybe not at all, and I've seen patients that because of maybe a skin issue, they maybe need that aid, and the aid may come even 5 or 7 days a week to help that family while that wound is being taken care of because of the situation that that individual is in. So the nurse, that aid, then who else do you have access to?
Well, you have access to a social worker who will not only help you with the disease process, the psychosocial component of the disease process, but will also help you if you need extra help. Say mom and dad are living with you and you work full time. What do you do? Because that's, a big thing. Here in Florida, we find family is in Missouri and patient is here in Florida.
We've got patients that are spread patients are here, but their families are spread coast to coast. And that social worker will help those people connect. They can help with FMLA papers. They can help with, I need to file something for insurance. Can you steer me in the right direction? Some things they can do for you, and some things they can steer you in the right direction.
Right.
What about if the family is upset or having anxiety or having depression of their own related to that patient's illness?
Yes, they spend a lot of time doing counseling with the family to have acceptance of disease, acceptance of the illness, and then they actually will have family meetings. So the patient will be included in those to try to meet everyone where they're at. Oftentimes, the patients, I feel, sometimes get left out because it's all about what they're doing. And it's great. They are doing a lot of the day-to-day care, so it adds a lot of stress to them. But sometimes it's really important to bring the patient in. And that's what a hospice social worker always includes the patient.
Because the patient's kind of the center of that team. And they may not be telling the services and the disciplines what needs to be done, but they're the ones that exhibit the symptoms or are suffering or have the disease, and so the team surrounds them to support them, and the hospice team also supports that family, whether they're local and in the home, local in the area, or they live in outlying areas.
Right. And the other thing to know, even if you're out of town, a lot of times a social worker will put you in contact with other people, and what I mean by other people, I mean other hospices, so they can go to support groups locally.
Yeah.
And that's really such a huge benefit. I've taken care of many dementia patients, and recently in my job change in the last year, one of my very first patients was a caregiver of a demented lady that I cared for, my gosh, back in 2010.
Wow.
Since then, he had another wife who unfortunately died from dementia. Wow. Well, then I met him via phone because he's 3 hours away, and he said, "You look so familiar. Did you have a daughter and blah, blah, blah that liked to dance and sing?" And I was like, "Yes." And since then, now I have a son. Well, long story short, I made the connection based on the facility that his wife lived in. I could see the room, I knew the room number, and made the connection. Well, he ended up becoming our patient, and since then has passed away because he was very sick with heart disease. But he kept saying to me how much he appreciated all the support groups that were at the facility.
Yeah.
He felt so relieved at the time his wife passed because the social worker and the interdisciplinary team, it would normally be the social worker and chaplain, would meet with that facility once a week. And then he said, "I was so much of a sucker, I fell in love again with another demented person and took care of her." So it was very cute. He was a very sweet man, but he got to see the benefit for 2 wives. By the way, became a hospice volunteer. Wow. Because he saw the significance and would bring flowers to places because that's what he liked to do, cut flowers in his yard and make bouquets. And then he himself ended up on hospice. And when I personally called in the consult for him, the whole hospice was crying at the thought of losing him. And he got what we say VIP treatment.
Yeah.
The director of volunteer and the director of bereavement, they were on his team. So he was very lucky.
So if you're on that team long enough, if you receive hospice long enough, you get an intimate relationship with your nurse, with your aide, with your social worker, and you mentioned chaplain.
Yes.
So I want to point out that chaplains are specially trained in hospice in multiple spiritual aspects, not just over a religious aspect.
Right.
They don't have their own flock. They don't have their own parish. What they do is they meet you where you are with your spirituality, which may be connected to religiosity and it may not. And so the chaplain also, you mentioned, was part of this patient's success with receiving the benefit of hospice so many times.
Right. So he had relationship with the chaplain, with the social worker, and that team had kind of stayed intact, even though it was, 10 years later almost that I cared for the original wife. And it was interesting because he was on a home team, so that would give him another set of individuals, but they kept, he got this assisted living team to care for him because he had already had relationship with the chaplain and, would still stay in touch with him even after losing both of his wives.
So the relationship with the hospice doesn't end with the patient. It extends to the family, and it doesn't end at the time of the passing. When the patient's death occurs, that relationship with that team, particularly the social worker, the bereavement coordinator, the chaplain, goes on for at least a year and possibly longer than that.
Right.
I just mentioned bereavement coordinator because that's another individual, another discipline that works with the patient and the family.
Yeah, and there's different stages of grief in the dying process, and unfortunately in hospice we even take care of children, so anticipatory grief with children is really, really high. So oftentimes bereavement is involved from day one, and then there's other families that just are having a hard time coping. Maybe they feel sorry that they live in New York and their family's in Southeast Florida or wherever they are, and they have a lot of guilt. So then we will invoke bereavement then. What I like about the bereavement team is they do help them anticipate the emotions of the dying process and actually formulate things. Like, oftentimes people just think, oh, hospice just comes in near death, like my patient that wants to have her dad drink beet juice, which she thinks is just as important as being on hospice. But in reality, the hospice will help the grandson, the daughter, the son, all understand the disease process, which will create a peace at dying and not have a lot of shame or feeling like you didn't do enough. I mean, beet juice, I hate to keep using this.
And she could have hospice and give the beet juice.
Absolutely.
Because hospice is not going to stop the beet juice. If she feels that's really important, there are patients who are on hospice that feel certain medications are really important, even though they may not be medically necessary. They have supplements or vitamins, and hospice is going to tell you it's not recommended, but they're not going to tell you can't take those things.
Yes, and speaking of medicines, that makes me think of another avenue. We started talking about long-term care when people go to rehab. There is, believe it or not, there is PT and OT that is part of the hospice. Speech therapy, yes.
And I know that in the institution where I work, everybody gets a rec therapy. They have pet therapy. So recreation, activities, involvement, being able to do is so important for these people that hospice will provide limited amount of those services. So they're not going to have therapy coming to the home 3 times a week for an hour each time, but they will help the family understand these are the things that you can help the patient with, because hospice centers around the patient being in their home environment and having the family involved with that care as end of life approaches.
Yeah, and oftentimes it's more, like Dr. Bone said, it's to give them the skill set to keep managing the patient in the home, because that's the goal. And then, sometimes we will do PT. We'll order it in a way, I don't know how to word it.
I usually order as strength, balancing, and strength, balance, and transfer is how I typically order it, because the patient may be in a wheelchair to a recliner, and the patient gets home from the hospital, or something has happened at home and they've gotten weaker, but there occurs a point in time where this patient now has had a change in condition, and the family is uncertain, how can I safely get this person from the wheelchair to the toilet? Because they still want to get to, even if it's just a bedside commode, they need to stand, pivot, transfer. And the family wants to be trained. They want the assessment of the therapist. They want to be able to see, what can we do to help strengthen this person? Is it possible now to make them stronger? And how can we do this safely in our home? What training do we need? What equipment do we need? What supplies do we need? And hospice will provide those things to help the patient have the best quality of life that they can.
When I was a hospice physician, we meet with the interdisciplinary team weekly. So sometimes the nurses and the CNAs would get a little bit defensive, like, why are we going to order this? You know, they're never going to get out of bed. We've been there 6 months. Sometimes we order it as physicians just so we can prove a point, like that we're going to try. We don't want to give up hope ever, but it's nice to help that the PT person, and oftentimes it's the same person that comes throughout their disease process, and they're able to add another subset of eyes, another opinion, and it helps with acceptance.
And I like listening to her, talk about how at the interdisciplinary team meeting, sometimes, the managers are like, why are we doing this? We don't need to do this. And the physician and the nurse that's caring for the patient, maybe the aide, we're all rallying to make sure that those patients get their benefit, because we want them to have that good as much as they can get. And so I understand, and I don't mean to offend, but I understand the bean counter is behind that, because hospice only gets one amount of money for those patients who are at routine home care. The patient doesn't pay for any of these services. It's all included in that. So the hospice gets, one check to take care of that patient, and then they have to spread that out over that care, because they're going to include the nurse, they're including the nurse practitioner that goes out, they're including the chaplain, they're including the social worker, and any equipment, any medications. All of that stuff is paid for, and the patient doesn't pay for any of it. But let's say you got the patient is at home, and maybe they've had some, little insults along the way. Maybe it's a dementia patient, and they've got vascular dementia, and now they've had another TIA. So their swallow is a little bit off. We may order speech therapy. Go out, reassess the patient, help the family understand what we need to do from here, teach them some new techniques. So they may need some visits from speech therapy to go out and evaluate that patient and find out, how is the swallow?
Yep, and we discuss different diets, and then we try to work with the family on what they would like for the patient, as well as what the patient can tolerate. And that is really a huge benefit, to have a speech therapist come out.
Speech therapy is critical for some of these people to be able to have a safe swallow. And there are some training tips that they can give to the patient and to the family that are crucial for them to be able to have a better swallow and have a better lifestyle.
And I just feel like, as a hospice and palliative physician, I've done this now for 20 years, it makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up when I hear these people declining, and I hear all the resistance of why not.
There are a lot of barriers to accepting hospice, but you need to be on the service long enough to get the good out of it. So let's extrapolate for just a minute. Let's say somebody in the family encourages the patient to accept hospice, and the patient accepts hospice, and they sign all these pieces of paper that they're now going to have their Medicare is going to pay for their hospice and not for traditional health care. Okay. Does that mean if I sign all that now I have to be a do not resuscitate?
No, you do not.
So I can still go back to the hospital?
Yes, you can.
So if I get short of breath in the middle of the night, I can call the ambulance and go to the hospital?
You absolutely can. Now, if the shortness of breath is related to your terminal illness, the hospice will meet you there. You will come off service. It's a no strings attached contract. I mean, it's not.
So am I harmed in any way by signing up? Do I have to pay anything when I come off of service?
No.
So then what if I'm in the hospital and they say you're ready to go home, but I know that I'm not going to be able to make it at home, because I had hospice maybe for just a few weeks, but I found so much benefit to having that nurse come and having that aide come, and I got to meet a doctor, and then a nurse practitioner came by, and I was really liking that service until I got a critical event and I had to go to the hospital. Can I have that back?
Absolutely. So part of your discharge plan with the team, the case managers in the hospital, will be that you will go back to hospice, and they just come back out, the admission nurse, and you get readmitted. And it's, it's not a big, it's a lot of paperwork on the hospice end, but for the patient and family, it's just another signature.
It's pretty seamless. And so there's no there's no damage to your insurance. It's not going to cost you anything financially. Let's say you've got a hospice patient who's on for heart trouble, and they can still be fairly active, but they slip in a little puddle of water in the kitchen, and they fall, and they have a trauma, and they have to go to the hospital. Let's say they break their shoulder, maybe they break their hip. You go to the hospital, and the hospice is going to meet you there, and they're going to say, yeah, you have some illness that's significant because you qualify for hospice, but would you like to have surgery on your shoulder? They're offering you a hip replacement or a hip pinning surgery. I can do those things.
Absolutely.
And then after I have my hip pinning, I'm still weak, but maybe I could tolerate maybe a little bit of rehab. And then I would go to rehab. When I'm ready to go home, I go back on hospice service.
So I feel like, in summary, we just want to emphasize that and take away the stigma of hospice, and understand that we want to get the good out of hospice in the final 6 months of life. And what I mean by the good of hospice, it's you get a whole interdisciplinary team. You get the nurse, you get the CNA, you get a chaplain, you get a physician. Some teams have ARNPs. You will get the whole benefit to come into your home to help you understand how you can care for someone who is beginning the dying process. The psychosocial support, the physical support, the equipment, the medications that are related to the terminal illness. These are all things that you can receive if you just would open your heart to hospice and accept that hospice is not a death sentence. It's not a near-death experience.
Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
We appreciate your comments.